The world is evolving at a faster pace than ever before, and as we begin the path to recovery after worldwide disruption, this podcast explores how the design industries can adapt to changing expectations and create a better future for both business and consumers. I'm Carla Buzasi, Managing Director of WGSN. You're listening to Create Tomorrow, the WGSN podcast. This week, I'm joined by Kara Nielsen, our Director of WGSN Food and Drink, who talks to me about how the pandemic has influenced not only what we eat, but how we think about food and drink too, and also divulges her new lockdown discovery. So without further ado, let's start the conversation. So, Cara, to kick us off, I wonder if you could give me a kind of overview of how you think this is going to evolve, not just what's happening in the short term, because we've seen crazy changes when it comes to consumer behaviour in this area, but what you expect to happen in the kind of short-term future as this kind of pandemic evolves, people are coming out of lockdowns and moving into this next normal.
It is really an extraordinary situation to be part of such a cataclysmic change that affects everybody on the planet. And it's been also so interesting to see how food and drink has played such a role and continues to be part of the bigger story. There, of course, was first the whole rush to try to feed ourselves and stock up on food. And that, I think, really actually helped people appreciate food and the people who make their food and bring their food to them so much more. So it was one of these amazing situations where all of a sudden people started appreciating everyone along the supply chain. And I think that kind of added awareness. We've already seen how that ripples out in kind of immediate businesses and how we're looking at essential workers. And then also how people are holding on to their food as something very precious and very important to them. So I think we're really seeing a value set about how we nourish ourselves, how important it is, and how important everybody is along the supply chain getting us the food that we need to live.
That's a very kind of positive take on it. Do you genuinely, in your heart of hearts, think that will continue, or do you think we'll just go back to a kind of, take it and leave it attitude that we just want it when we want it and we don't really care how that got to us in the first place?
I don't think it's going to go back all the way to that. I don't think it can be. Had the pandemic lasted 6 weeks and it blew over, then yes, we hadn't had the opportunity to make any kind of changes. But it's just going on too long. We see wave after wave. It's happening on a global scale. And the news, I'm afraid, is only going to get worse. We're hearing more and more about businesses like restaurants and bars that aren't able to reopen. Every day, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. There's another list of businesses that have decided to close. Some are just heartbreaking. And so I think these personal stories that people read about, things in their own community, stores that aren't going to be available. And that's just on the immediate local level. On a higher level of food supply, I think more people than ever have started thinking about who is packing their meat. Where's their chicken coming from? As we hear about stories of the pandemic really, affecting workers in meatpacking plants in the US, in Germany, in Brazil. It's a global issue. I think sadly, it's going to be a much bigger negative impact, but one that is going to force everyone, consumers around the world, to look at their food differently and think about, well, how are we going to make sure we have food? Can we really depend on these supply chains?
So, look, we're trend forecasters. We talk about trends all the time, and certainly a big trend in restaurants has been this kind of local produce, the kind of farm to table. That's been around for a few years now. But the reality of the situation is, I still want my avocados. I still want to be able to get hold of that fresh produce that is not being grown. And I'm sitting here in the UK, that is not being grown at a farm down the road because they just couldn't do it in that climate. Do you think that's going to change as well? Or do you think our kind of tastes have evolved to a certain extent that we still want to be able to get hold of things all year round?
Well, that's a really good point. And when we look at the future of food on the really big picture, a lot of things that many of us adore, starting with coffee and going to chocolate, olive oil, these are already somewhat endangered commodity crops. This is tough news to share, but already, the changes that are happening with the plants, how they can grow, we're already going to start seeing things become more expensive. We'll start seeing some supply shortages. And this is really big picture. This isn't tomorrow. But I personally have started stocking up on maple syrup as things are going to start changing here. But I think we are going to have to change our attitudes to, we're not going to be able to have those avocados every day or whatever it might be. And we will start learning about preservation. I think the food industry will get very entrepreneurial, and we will start looking at ways of transforming fresh food into things that are shelf-stable. We actually wrote a kids snack report that published last week where we talked about an avocado puff that's made from real avocados and avocado oil. So that may be your way of getting your guacamole fix, is actually a shelf-stable guacamole puff, which sounds really fun. And maybe, we just will need to tweak and pivot a little bit and turn to some different forms of these favorite foods.
So what does that mean if you work in innovation or R&D for a big food manufacturer? You're creating products that maybe go on shelves in supermarkets or something similar, depending on where in the world you are. What does that mean now in terms of the products that you're going to have in one country versus another country, or maybe even a region of one country versus another region?
Well, the good news is that the large food manufacturers have been working and always work on these types of questions. How can food last long? What are our ways of preserving foods? I mean, we think of all the fresh foods that we now buy in the grocery store. For example, you maybe used to go out at lunchtime and go down to a small version of a grocery store and pick up a fresh made sandwich out of a prepared food case. And maybe you grabbed a little tub of salad or fresh fruit. Well, some of those things may not be as easily obtainable. However, we lived without them for quite a long time as well. And so perhaps we're just going to go back to making more of our own food, looking at more shelf-stable food. And the food industry is really good at that kind of food. They basically created it. And we will just, again, we had a huge uptick in values around fresh food that came over the last 10 years, but perhaps we're going to be looking and our values will switch and we'll be looking for things that last longer but still give us the nutrients we want. But the good news is, too, the food manufacturers are also really great at making food like that taste delicious and be nutritious, which is really what we're going to want as well.
I think there's a bit of a re-education there, isn't it? Because we have been told ad nauseum that fresh is better. And clearly being able to get something which is still full of the nutrients because it's just come out of the ground or it's come off a tree, you can see the advantages to that. But education around preserving but also freezing food, and the fact that if it's frozen very quickly, you're still going to encapsulate all of those, especially as I think we've sort of been trained, hopefully not to stockpile, but at least have supplies when you know that potentially the area you're in might go into lockdown and you don't want to be caught short in the way so many of us were at the beginning of this. I just want to kind of pivot on that slightly and talk a little bit about kind of safety. When we've been talking about the next normal in terms of beauty, totally different industry, but many similarities. Consumers there are becoming obsessed, understandably, about the cleanliness and the safety of the product. So how is it packaged and what's in it to ensure that it's not going to do any harm to them or their skin? How is that being translated in the food and drink industry? Are people going to have to change their packaging because of nervousness from consumers? Or do you think they've kind of got that box ticked because it's been sort of a part and parcel of what they do for so many years?
Well, you do make a good point that food safety has always been paramount and is part of how food is already packaged the shelf life dates, those freshness dates that we look at. How food is made is very much dependent on what's the shelf life going to be. This is one of the first things that go into new innovation is this destined for the refrigerator? Is this destined for the freezer? So that is already part and parcel. However, people's concerns will grow for sure. I think what we're seeing now is a real change in packaging as well as methods for getting food from one place to the next. We are relying so much more on delivery of both our groceries, which include, ambient groceries as well as fresh groceries, and then all the restaurant food that we are getting for takeout. We're looking at how is that food being transported to our house? What are some of the ways that we are seeing services ensure that the person that is giving it to you is also in good health. So we've already started seeing badges of good health, delivery people wearing a little sticker saying that they've had their temperature checked. We've seen packaging increase. We've seen an increase in the amount of packaging, which of course goes against our previously held values around sustainability, reducing single-use plastic. I mean, we're in a real funny limbo right now. Is like, well, what is the highest level priority? And it's health and safety. And so we're sort of overcompensating for that at the moment. But I do feel that the packaging industry is busy working on new solutions. We have not abandoned sustainability around packaging. We just have rejiggered it for the moment and probably added more packaging as we kind of settle out and determine, how are we going to shop in the future? What are our options? What are our packaging needs? And what are solutions to that? So it's a funny moment right now, but I think sustainability has not gone out of the equation.
Let's talk a little bit about the diets that people have. Now, at the beginning of the pandemic, in the first kind of month or so, there was lots about the fact that, COVID-19 has come from these markets in China, and therefore everyone's going to become vegan because they're worried about animals transferring diseases to us. Do you think that this has accelerated veganism? Do you think it's accelerated any other kind of diets? Or do you think that was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction? And actually it's more about the farm to table and the local and the nutrition and those kind of things that are becoming important?
I think both of those things are happening. And so we have certainly seen people look for alternatives to animals, in part here in the United States, for example, with poultry processing plants and meat processing plants shut down and workers being not quarantined. That was the first thing that happened. There was a disruption in the meat supply. Meat disappeared from grocery stores in some places. The prices increased. And that was naturally led people to look for other options and find protein from plants, whether that's, rice and beans or nutritious chickpea, protein-rich pasta, whatever they could find. But I think that's also, as we were talking about earlier, really pulled the curtain back on the challenges around the meat processing industry that will perhaps be that one more push that certain consumers needed to convince themselves they need to invest more. Now, they may not become vegan 100% of the time, but we're already seeing that a lot of the plant-based meat alternatives that are being marketed and that we read about every day are very much designed for omnivores. They taste like meat, they look like meat. People who've given up meat years ago are typically less interested in those types of products. So the good news is there are a lot more choices for everybody, really. And I do think this is going to push more people to that. But in the same token, we've also seen, and we included this, we were writing about summer grilling and what are the things that you're putting on the grill, and along with whole vegetables and more plant-based items, we were also seeing meat coming from local ranchers. Different parts of the country have different availability, of course, but there are smaller meat companies, farms that are able to provide meat at a higher cost, of course, lower supply, but there are options, and those companies are doing really well. They are selling online. They are able to, ship their products because their way of processing the meat is outside of that large industrial process. They're still cutting the meat in a regulated facility, so it's not like, they're just doing it on the farm. There definitely is a process for it, but I have read about an increase in sales there. So for people who are really able to do that, and of course there's a price differential of buying that kind of local meat, those are options on both sides.
Something a bit more serious now. The spotlight on the Black Lives Matter movement, which has taken place in the past few months, which has really opened the conversation about diversity and inclusion in workplaces. I mean, across every topic area, it has set out a kind of a mission, I think, for the food and drink industry in terms of cultural appropriation, what's right and appropriate as a food producer or even a chef. What's your take on this, and how do you think that's going to change the industry as a consequence?
I think it's definitely accelerating those efforts, which have had here in the United States at least a bit of a stop-start pattern. As you know, every unfortunate incident that has been happening over the last number of years has raised awareness. There's still so much more awareness to be raised. There's a much better understanding to have happen. This has been sort of the most exciting change, and for certainly the most saddest reason. But I'm seeing the impact so much faster. Perhaps impacts changes that was coming. People had talked about. Well, now they're really doing it, and it's long overdue, as we know. And it's going to take. I was reading about certain activists feel, this could take a generation or more. I mean, these are unfortunate situations that have been entrenched in society around the world for centuries, trying to make room for indigenous cultures, indigenous ingredients, traditional ways of making food. On the one hand, it's long overdue, and it couldn't happen any sooner. I mean, we really need this knowledge. I've been reading articles about Native Americans that have all kinds of knowledge about how to live through tough times and ways of growing food, preserving food, and getting through these crises. And I think every indigenous culture around the globe, on every continent, has this knowledge. They also have the knowledge on the plants that can grow and survive through some of these global warming issues that we're encountering now. There's so much knowledge and centuries and centuries of knowledge in tending the land, knowing how to ask for what is possible, not ask for everything under the sun. And so I think we'll be very grateful to be benefiting from the knowledge of these peoples in various regions around the world, and learning and adapting and trying to make right as best we can every day. I think this is an everyday prospect. And I'm really excited, for one, that there is so much more room for voices, and look forward to being able to talk about those changes as they come forth.
Good. Okay. Let's talk about drinks for a minute. We've talked quite a lot about food already. Now, I'm sitting in the UK, and we have obsessed during this about whether people are drinking more alcohol, whether they're drinking less alcohol. I think the takeaway is that people are drinking more alcohol, and they're drinking it in their homes, despite the fact that restaurants and pubs, we obviously have quite pub culture here, were closed. They're open again now. But I read something very sad, that even though the amount of alcohol that people are drinking has risen in this country, small vineyards and producers of wine are finding it very hard, because their end market tended to be restaurants, whereas supermarkets will buy big batches from the big kind of household brand names. Where do you think the opportunity here is? And I'm not talking about an opportunity for consumers to drink more and more alcohol. Hopefully there's an opportunity to do that in a healthy and safe way. But if you are a small manufacturer at the moment, what's the next step for you in terms of connecting to that consumer and taking advantage of this new normal?
Yeah, that's a really good question because there are so many, whether it's a small farmer, a small maker, a small wine producer that used to have a marketplace in restaurants, and that, of course, has evaporated. Now, we are seeing some restaurants figure out how to come back online. It's certainly not at the same level, but I think the small guys will need to band together. And it's sort of what has happened over time where you have, so I remember when the recession hit many years ago now, and a lot of people lost their job and they started making whatever their specialty was, whether it was some candy or a certain pickle or a food item. And these were people who were, bankers, whatever they may have been. They lost their job and they went to food, and we started having these underground markets. And the underground markets, and I say underground, they weren't underground, but they just weren't really legal. And people would go and we'd buy this food. And we were super excited about it. People didn't get sick. Everybody was fine. But because of those markets, basically small people found a marketplace. And eventually there were websites that represented a lot of these small makers because they were each too small to have their own website or to create an online ordering system. So I think we're going to see this same kind of collectiveness come back again, that small wineries will band together, the ones that want to work together, and perhaps we'll see a collective of small vineyards on one website platform from a certain region or a certain appellation. Perhaps they will take turns doing tastings. They will put together a tasting box. So you might get a case of wine that has 12 different wines in it, similar to a CSA basket with little instructions on how to eat that. But it's very much about collectivity, coming together to be bigger, to find new marketplace tools. Luckily, there's so many more than there were 10 years ago with the last recession. It's much easier to get online, but you still have to find your audience, and that remains difficult. How you market, how you get out there. It's a crowded space. So I do think we'll see more collective selling groups, more subscription type deals. People will continue to develop relationships. I'm already getting more email from the wineries with whom I'm connected, and I can see even the ones that are well established are trying to maintain those ties. So I think that coming together in various different ways will be what we'll see.
It's a real time for creativity and collectivity, which I think is a really kind of nice summary. Right, just to wrap things up, is there anything that you personally in this space have discovered during lockdown? And I'll give you mine first. So I actually have a Filipino family. My aunt is married to a Filipino, so my cousins are half Filipino, and I've spent time in the Philippines, but many years ago. And while I was there, we drank quite a lot of calamansi juice, which I'd totally forgotten about. And then I was in a supermarket, masked up, obviously, and saw this little jar, or little kind of vial of calamansi juice, which I bought. And we've been putting it on everything. The kids love it. We sprinkle it on salads. We've been putting it on stir fries. And actually, the way that we would do in the Philippines, which is putting it with sugar and water and creating kind of very refreshing drinks. So calamansi juice, not a new thing, obviously, in many countries, and something which I experienced, I think, for the first time when I was 17 or something, but has been my rediscovery of lockdown. So is there anything that you've discovered or rediscovered during this time?
Well, you talked about people drinking more at home, and I have to say, I really appreciated when someone would make a good cocktail for me. And I didn't necessarily make cocktails for myself at home because I love going out. It's just part of my job, actually, to be there. But with the lack of cocktails available, I decided I was going to learn how to make a cocktail. So I love aviations. I don't know if you know this drink, if it's popular. The aviation is a drink from around the early part of the 1900s, so 1919, something like that. And it is a very classic cocktail made with gin, maraschino liqueur, lemon juice, and the secret ingredient, creme de violette. And creme de violette is a shocking purple color. It had basically gone out of production for decades after the drink, probably went away before Prohibition. And with the craft cocktail scene that came back, the company in France that was making this started making it again and importing it to the United States. So now one can buy a nice bottle of creme de violette and you can make your own aviation. And I like mine finished off with a Luxardo cherry, just the most indulgent, wonderful cherry to put in your drink. And the whole drink is just this lovely color of violet. Pretty simple and really lovely. And so that's my new thing that I learned how to make.
I love that. I'm going to go and look up that recipe and I'm going to attempt to take one, and I will send you a photograph later.
I'll send you mine.
Thank you so much to Carla Nielsen for taking the time to join me today. I will definitely be trying out that cocktail this evening. And thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, then please subscribe to the show, which is available on all major podcast platforms. And if you really like what you heard, then please leave us a rating and review on iTunes. If you're interested in what we've been talking about today, then head over to WGSN.com, where you can find out how you can get access to all of our insight and analysis. We're constantly publishing new reports around how we can design a better, brighter future for our industry. So thanks again to my guest, Kara. I'd also like to thank our podcast producer, Roland Bodenham, and thank you again for listening. Peter Marion will be back in 2 weeks for the next episode. So until then, stay well, stay healthy, and we'll see you next time.